So there's some pretty good research that our parents' trauma can be transmitted to us, not just through our childhoods and interactions and experiences with them, but also quite possibly through epigenetics. Basically, that the genes are transmitted from our parents to us. And epigenetics looks at how the environment activates or doesn't activate, how it affects the turning off and when and all of that around gene expression in us. And so I'm going to make a video talking more about this soon because I know we've been talking a lot about intergenerational trauma. And I've been doing a lot of reading on Rachel Yehuda's work. And it's just really fascinating to think about that as someone who talks so much about my own parents' transmission of trauma, at least biological and non-biological, to understand that on the one hand, my non-biological father had a lot of trauma. And yet there couldn't have really been a gene transmission for us. But me being exposed to him certainly had a trauma transmission, for example. And my mom, who I'm at this point pretty sure is my biological mother, didn't really have any significant childhood trauma. And it doesn't mean that she didn't have some relational trauma. I know that her mother did, though, quite significantly. And interestingly enough, her mother was raised by a single mother and was an only child. And then my grandmother had 3 boys and a daughter. My mom had me, and only child, really raised pretty much alone. And then I had 3 sons and a daughter, which is just, I don't know, it's interesting to think about. But what's really just making my brain get more and more curious as I talk about things like hypervigilance and hypersensitivity and that scanning for fear, thinking about how we might do that as a result of attachment patterns, for example, like an anxious or disorganized attachment pattern. That is so interesting and it kind of makes sense. But what about the children of parents who were survivors of serious life events like wars and things like that? How their children have had markers around certain types of expressions like lower cortisol with or without PTSD in the parent, and which parent, depending upon which parent carried which set of traumas and dynamics, how that has played out in later generations. And even in studies using mice where they were able to train mice through behavioral reinforcement, schedules to have a real desire to avoid the smell. I think it was cherry blossom. Basically because it was paired with a very uncomfortable shock. And that in further generations of those mice's children, they basically were born already having this disdain and fear and avoidance of the cherry blossom. And then over multiple generations, they could reverse it and extinguish that response. So it is so fascinating to think about what happens to our parents, how it affects us. And I found that so many people don't really know true family histories. It's crazy how much my whole family knew, for example, certain things about my biology with my father, and no one told me. And I found out at 42 and didn't even get confirmation that they knew until years later. And so the point is that it's just, I think, important to talk about, and we're going to talk more about this piece of trauma transmission, both the actual experiences and those that are living in our DNA and cells. But it made me think about also how many people I work with who come to see me because they've had parents who struggle with something like undiagnosed borderline, narcissism. Now I'm beginning to question things like autism, ADHD, especially around certain dynamics. Obviously things like bipolar, trauma for sure. And how they can often think that they are just like their parents and be kind of horrified and terrified. Like, am I a narcissist too? Do I have borderline? And while they certainly could, and some of those things can increase the risks for having those disorders, we know now that trauma and autism and borderline and narcissism and ADHD and all of these differences and dynamics have these overlapping symptoms. And so what I wanted to do was just give you 11 signs to explore if you had what I pretty much refer to, and I'm so sorry for the construction, I have no way to avoid it, it's been going on forever, is to, if you have like what I call eggshell parents, which is really my word for everything I just described, alongside a few other things. But the core is about parents who are emotionally, relationally, and behaviorally unpredictable, inconsistent on differing levels, from maybe like quietly narcissistic and shutting you out, all the way up to raging and screaming with narcissism or something like borderline or autism or ADHD. And also often have things like enmeshment, parentification, boundary issues. It's just a way, much like the term emotionally immature parents, which when you break that down often look like what I'm calling also eggshell parents, except for we're always talking here about the eggshell piece, which to me creates hypervigilance, chronic hypervigilance, a need to scan, and often hypersensitivity, training us to respond as children. Okay, so these are the things that can be happening for you. And what I'd encourage you to do is to take a look at each one that you think, yeah, that might actually relate to me. I'm going to pause because I'm sure this sound is triggering for you guys. Hold on one second. Okay, I think the beeping stopped. Is to look at each of these signs and to look at how much it affects your life. If you're curious about, maybe I should get some therapy, I want to get an assessment, I need to do some more reading about these individual topics, Google them. See how much you relate to them and how much difficulty they're causing in your life. The first one is black and white thinking. And this is very common, especially in parents or caregivers who struggle with something like borderline or narcissism, where they have a difficult time holding what they feel is the bad stuff. And so they project it onto you, they place it onto others, they offload it. And it basically helps them split things into good, bad, right, wrong. It's a quick systemic way for them to not deal with all of the yucky stuff that gets brought up inside. And often it becomes, like I'm saying, put onto you. So you're like the best child ever, the worst child ever. You look so beautiful today, and why are you such a slob, and what's going on? Or, they do it to themselves as well. I'm all good, I'm all bad. And so it's a real difficulty seeing the gray area. And I've noticed in a lot of people I've worked with over the years, when they especially seem to have parents who struggle like this, that they often do the same things. And they really do it to themselves more than anything else. They can often hold gray area. In fact, sometimes a lot of compassion and empathy for others, but they do this splitting in themselves a lot. And so they see themselves as worthy, unworthy, bad, good, successful, a failure. These are the people often who get a B plus and think it's an F. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but also in this newer generation of children, that's a very common dynamic, especially in certain environments and I would say communities. And so where the parents have often, in their own pursuits of the best and all of that, have overly focused on what it means to be successful. So the point is that you split that way. And so you might have a hard time even holding compassion for yourself because you're all good or all bad. So that's important. Number two, you have a deep distrust in human beings. And it can look like what is in borderline, this unstable, stormy relationship pattern. But it's not necessarily big storms. It's just that at the core, you don't really trust people. And so it's not that you're acting out and causing a lot of difficulty or trying to be harmful, but you might lean into friendships and then lean out. You might be in friendships and take way too much and not set boundaries and then one day be done. You might have friends that you're friends with for years, but you're always like low-key beefing with them, annoyed with them, talking bad about them to your partner or your kids, whatever. It's like there are these wounds going on. And it could be because they actually are a kind of reenactment of your family system where they're really not great friends. They're really not stable. They're really not safe. That's definitely a big possibility. Like they feel like home. But it can also be that you overly judge them and you're like, got your microscope out. I don't know what I'm doing. You have your microscope out because you're always looking for confirmation that they're going to harm you, don't care about you, whatever. And yet they have good parts, kind of like the splitting thing. And so you stay in it. But the point is, it's never really like your full self is in there, because deep inside, you're always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, to be betrayed, distrust to play out. Number 3, you tend to avoid conflict. You self-silence. I made a whole video about this, I think about a month ago. But the point is, in many of these homes with these dynamics, anger was not safe. And so you avoid conflict. You avoid speaking up for yourself. You avoid setting boundaries. You avoid self-advocacy. You really, when it comes to anything that feels like uncomfortable emotions that even veer into anger or conflict, you just basically shut down and stuff that. The next one is you often have, and it's described in borderline as identity disturbance, where they can often struggle with like, who am I? And so they're changing the way they look and what they relate to. I would call this a different version for those of us who have these parents. We have been trained and raised to rotate around our caregivers, and we know how to be, for example, pleasers, fawners, compulsive caretakers. But we often don't really know who we are because we weren't allowed to have this space to explore who we were. So it's not some raging crisis that's getting acted out, but like deep inside, you might not really feel like, well, who am I? And what do I really love and like? And what do I hate? And what's important to me? And part of that work can be really pushing yourself into identity work. Actually, I have one of those in my new course, in the course on eggshell parents. There's a whole lesson on and exercises on identity, because I really believe from our roots and trauma, it goes through all the way up to today and our dreams and goals, we often don't know who we are. The next one is we often have a lot of, I would say, secret emotional dysregulation. So for many of us, our parents had really big feelings that they acted out. And it wasn't safe for us to have those big feelings. We were sent to our rooms or punished or mocked or minimized or even shamed. And so we're having a lot going on, but you may not see it. And I think that can look kind of like that avoidant attachment, where on the outside, when in the babies in the strange situation, the kids looked like they were like fine with mommy leaving the room. But when they measured their cortisol levels and heart rate and all of that, they were just as upset as the babies who were melting down. But it's like that containment. And so you tend to deal with big feelings alone, act out your feelings, whether it's, we'll talk about another section is numbing and substances and addictions. You isolate. But the point is, a lot is going on for you and it triggers a lot of shame, but you don't really know what to do with that. And so you just kind of like grin and bear it. Or you just feel like you're always trying to manage these high highs and low lows inside. Number 6 is what looks like someone could say, oh, you're just being a victim, is really your chronic resentment for never being seen. And so you do have wounds, but you've been told, like, get over it. That was your childhood. Stop blaming your parents. And yes, I don't think that it gets us anywhere to just stay in blame. I think it's important to do the work to understand, like, what happened to me and what shaped me. And is there room to heal that with my parents today? Because there's a big difference in saying, yeah, my parents were like not great in childhood, but we're really good now. That's one thing. And yet, or as opposed to saying my parents weren't great in childhood and they're still not great now. The point is there can be a lot of activation that you are being victimized and you're so used to that role, you don't really know it. But it can look like you're just like resentful. You never feel appreciated. And it goes back to often you're overdoing things in caretaking. You're not setting boundaries. You don't know that though. Like you think that you're doing all the things to make you a good caretaker or different kind of parent. And in many ways you are, but you feel deeply unseen for that. And look, if you expect your younger kids, even to their, teen years, to like really validate you and say how great you are, you're wasting your time. Not that they don't appreciate you and can't say beautiful, lovely things, but I think some parents are expecting their kids to like fill everything up for them. And why aren't they grateful? And they have more than I had. And when your kids are growing up, they don't necessarily know that. And that's a good thing that they don't know what you had, that they kind of take it for granted. I promise you that more often than not, as they get into their 20s and beyond, and also each child is a different personality, so you might get more gratitude from different children. They do see it. They do see your flaws, your strengths, where they just see you. And that's where it goes back to co-parenting. Like, eventually they see who you are. I've always said, my kids know the good, bad, the ugly being fully raised by me. And I'm okay with that, right? It's like, I don't need to be perfect, and neither do you. But overarchingly, we want to try to be safe, reliable, consistent, not perfectly, once again, but generally, not highly unpredictable, things like that. The next one is that you often have high anxiety. So you have an anxious attachment at times. So it looks like at times you're really like worried about people leaving you or hurting your feelings or not, responding to you. You overread things. And that's that anxious part of your attachment. And yet, number 8 is you can also be highly avoidant. And so you get only so close to people, going back to that trust dynamic, and then you back out. When things get too vulnerable, too much, you might have walls up that you don't know about. I talked about that last week. And so the point is, though, that you can have these things that don't seem to make sense, and they really kind of fit that more disorganized attachment or fearful avoidant one, but they aren't on the highly clinical end. Like, none of these are so highly obvious that you're in crisis mode. These are things that have become part of what, really who you are. So high avoidance, high anxiety. Number 9 is that you are often, at the core, you identify as highly sensitive, empathic, and you really are always in a state of scanning people and making meaning. And that is the heart of hypervigilance that's chronic, and it often comes with that piece of hypersensitivity. And that's what I talk about in my course, that the one I just put out is that it becomes your trauma personality. Like, it's just who you think you are. So you scan and make meaning from whatever nervous system state you're in, most often a fight or flight state. And as Deb Dana talks about, and Stephen Porges in polyvagal theory, the state needs a story. You need a story. That is that making meaning I keep talking about. And so we learn to make, I scan. My husband's moody and he's going to start yelling at me tonight. He's pouring a drink. My mommy came home from the store and slammed the garage door. Or just hearing the sound of the keys in the doorway is triggering, because back in childhood, that meant something was going to be a bad night. My parent was highly unstable. And now when my spouse jiggles their keys, my hairs, they kind of go up on the back of my neck. And I have to remind myself, for example, wait, I'm safe. It's fine. So things like that. The point is, you've been doing that. You're sensitive, you're empathic. And then the flip side to that is that you've learned to abandon yourself and neglect yourself. And so it's not necessarily highly extreme, but there's a pattern of you neglecting self-care, doctor's appointments. I'm not even talking about like massage and things like that. I'm talking about basic self-care. And of course, if you have other difficulties that are on the neurodivergent spectrum, like autism, ADHD, those can also make it even harder to get those things done. And that can add to a sense of like shame and what's wrong with me, while always focusing, once again, in that state of hypervigilance on everything and everyone else, making meaning, overanalyzing, overthinking. And then number 10 is that you often have emotional enmeshment, and with your kids and with your partners. And what this looks like is, I still struggle with this. When my kids get really emotional, like my daughter's really crying, it's so much better now, but it would trigger this like panic inside of me. Like, I almost couldn't tolerate it because I was so upset for her. I don't mean tolerate like she wasn't allowed to have it. It was so intolerable to my nervous system, because I would have those meltdowns alone or be punished for them in childhood. And to have her be upset spirals my, oh my God, I have to fix this. I can't fix this. What do I do? And it can trigger all kinds of nervous system dysregulation. And so it's really important. I just posted a Instagram about this today, to learn to sit with your kids or your spouse or partners and be able to be present with them when they're having big feelings, because that can be so triggering. But for you to be able to be okay to yourself, like, these are their feelings, they're not mine. I'm safe. I can provide a good guide for safety here. I can tolerate their feelings. It's about breathing together, validating them, and being present with them. I don't have to do anything magical. I just have to be here with them and validate them and tolerate their feelings and what their feelings are bringing up in me. Because for many of us, big feelings, going back to these kind of parents who struggle, meant that they were going to yell or scream or cry or need us to be a best friend or a little parent, a little old soul, all of those things. And if you're not aware of that, it can be really triggering. So you kind of like can blend into your partner's feelings and then it becomes really personal, for example, right? Or you can't tolerate it, or you say or do things you wish you didn't because you're just trying to offload and get them happy right now. And, sadness, anger, disappointment, failure are all parts of life, just like love and joy and success and things like that. And then the last thing is, these are all theoretically non-clinical to the point where none of them are in crisis mode. But what do you do to numb? Do you binge watch shows, scroll on your phone? Do you play video games for hours? Do you do too many hobbies? Do you dissociate? Do you use substances, have addictions? Like, what do you do? And a lot of that is because that dysregulation that we're hiding, like I was talking about earlier, we're functioning enough, but we're struggling. And we didn't get the skills and tools in childhood to help us manage those things. So those are all what I perceive as, obviously all together. It could be very much a clinical picture. But if you're kind of like this one, not that one, or a little bit here, the point is for you to do some self-reflection on which of those are happening for you, and then to go seek out resources. I'll list a few books just around these kind of parenting issues in the comment section, or in the notes section, I guess, because there are places you can go if you want to learn more about attachment, or you want to learn more about emotional regulation or polyvagal theory, things like that, because those are really important. But the goal of this video is to give you a little temperature check on how do you think you're doing with these things that you just kind of inherited, literally, could be genetically, alongside the environment and all of that, and to give you some space to just self-reflect and figure out what you might need to support yourself. So hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for being here. Have a good day, a good weekend, and I think I might see you this weekend. I'm not sure yet. My plan is to post one more video, hopefully on Sunday. All right, have a good day. Take care.